What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily, and in this video, we are checking out the new 2024 Motorola Moto G Play. Now, you guys might remember that last year's Moto G Play received a special award from me when I reviewed it, the worst phone of the year. And I'm hoping that aside from the few of you who called me mean names in the comments, that someone from Motorola actually watched that video and maybe took some of my critiques seriously. If you aren't familiar, here in the US, the Moto G Play is Motorola's entry-level budget smartphone. It's the lowest end Moto G. And if you're just looking for an affordable Android device for the bare essentials, this would seem kind of enticing, but last year's Moto G Play was literally unusable. It was a phone that was so bad at everything that I truly didn't understand how Motorola could responsibly sell such a device to the general public. However, this year's new 2024 Moto G Play looks to be way better. Perhaps Motorola really did listen. This is an all-new phone, inside and out, with a more modern design, better specs across the board, and I think it might just be the entry-level Moto device that doesn't feel like you got scammed into buying a dud, but rather a half-decent smartphone for the everyday essentials. There is definitely a lot to talk about with this phone, and I'm going to fill you in on everything else you need to know, including all the things Motorola improved from last year. But first things first, let's just quickly unbox it so I can show you the couple of things you'll get if you decide to buy one. So slicing into the sticker there and flipping open the lid, the first thing you get is the phone itself, of course. It comes in one color, just like the previous year's, sapphire blue. Underneath that, you're reminded about how eco-friendly Motorola's packaging is. As for the included accessories, well, you get lots of paperwork, a SIM ejector tool, and a USB-A to USB-C cable for charging the phone, and then enough recycled cardboard inserts to cut down a rainforest. Between the bulky packaging and USB-A charging cable, I don't know how Motorola can still perpetuate this feigned eco-friendly stance, but hey, I'm here to criticize the phone, not their packaging. With all that stuff out of the way, here is the new 2024 Moto G Play. And right off the bat, the single most enticing thing about this phone is the price. So let's talk about that for just a second. The full retail price for this guy on launch is $149. Now that's actually cheaper than last year. It was $169. But the thing about Motorola phones is that they're very rarely ever for sale at their full original retail price. So depending on when you watch this video, I'm sure the Moto G Play will be listed on Amazon or even Motorola's own website at a discount before too long, and if it happens to hit carriers and prepaid networks later this summer like Motorola phones tend to do, it'll probably even be a free device with a new line. And if you're interested in doing some comparison shopping of your own, I'll leave some links down below in the video description to where you can get this phone at its cheapest current price. So like I mentioned at the start, this new Moto G Play doesn't look anything like last year's phone. It's now way more in line with the current higher-end Moto devices. That was one of my first critiques last year. At 6.5 inches, this is still a fairly large device, and the chunky black borders and bulbous bottom chin add just a bit more to its overall form factor. But this phone is actually a few millimeters smaller all around, thanks to a better, if you can believe it, screen-to-body ratio. It's still a slightly elongated, tall sort of phone, but I think most of us are pretty much used to using something this size nowadays. Around back, this year's shade of blue, dubbed sapphire blue, is a little more shiny and metallic versus the indigo blue and misty blue of years past, but don't let its fancy modern design and super sleek camera bump fool you. This is still an all-plastic budget build. The very minimal camera bump, though, is something I really do like, and the phone now has a water repellent design, which still doesn't seem like an actual IP rating, but a splash here and there shouldn't kill this thing. The only other thing of note with the design is a very flat phone, no taper, no contours along the edges, but it has this odd layering with the black plastic screen edge sitting over the rear housing. Taking a look around at everything else, on the left side, this phone does have a SIM and SD card tray, and expandable storage is great. On the one hand, Motorola actually doubled the onboard storage this year for this phone, all the way up to a whopping 64 gigabytes, but yeah, you'll still want an SD card for sure. On the right side, the volume button's just above the power button, and this now doubles as your fingerprint sensor. Last year's phone had the super old school M logo dimple fingerprint sensor on the back, so this is a lot better for sure. There's actually still a headphone jack up top too. At the bottom, the USB-C port alongside one of two speakers on this phone. The secondary speaker is within the earpiece above the selfie camera, and around back, this is really odd, one camera lens on this thing, and that other circle there is just the LED flash. Now, I feel compelled to mention that in setting up this phone, you are presented with more than a dozen optional but pre-checked apps you can install if you want, though compared to last year, the bloatware and other garbage is few and far between. There's a new lock screen option you're presented with as well called Glance if you want some unique dynamic lock screen images, but what was most annoying is this phone took probably 45 or more minutes to install and update, and based on the fact that this is still on Android 13 with the December security patch, I have no idea what it was even installing that whole time. When it comes to the viewing experience, the Moto G Play's big ol' 6.5-inch display is still just a 1600 by 720 resolution IPS LCD panel. At this size, you get some 270 pixels per inch, which just isn't very sharp. You can absolutely pick out those pixels on screen if you look closely enough at it, but like I often say, if you don't know any different, if you've been using Motorola devices the last few years, this is the same display you're already used to, so it might not be a big deal. It seems like Motorola maybe increased the max brightness on the screen, which is a welcome change, and there's a specific note about it now being covered in Gorilla Glass 3, which I guess helps out the glare problem a little bit more. But the screen specs are as basic and as bare bones as you can get. The only saving grace is this is a 90 Hz panel, so when you enable that option in settings, you do actually get a more fluid, responsive, and visually pleasing look. And that's not just due to the 90 Hz alone. That's also due in part because this phone actually performs better. More on that in a moment. All in all though, this is a screen that's fine for YouTube videos and some Twitter scrolling. I mean, it being so big is definitely a plus, but other than that, it's very much still a budget display. A dual speaker setup for your out loud listening pleasure makes a triumphant return on a Motorola device here, and actually the speakers sound kind of decent. They're supposedly associated with Dolby Atmos in some capacity, and here's a quick sound sample so you can get an idea yourself.
As long as it's with you. Without you, I remember myself, my name. Forgot about all you tried to change. Familiar was the sound of your voice as I continue to.
So the single biggest issue I had with last year's Moto G Play was its performance and the general usability of the phone, which is sort of a big important thing because if you can't reliably use the phone as a phone, well, then it's just a brick. Fortunately, Motorola actually stuck a decent processor in this year's phone. They added a little more RAM, they doubled the storage, gave it a new but still 1 year behind Android update, and in playing around with this thing out of the box here, it is a significantly better experience. The new Moto G Play is powered by the Qualcomm Snapdragon 680 4G chipset. Did I mention this is a 4G phone, by the way? Yeah, that's one of the reasons it's still so cheap. It also has 4 gigs of RAM versus 3 in last year's device, and like I mentioned already, 64 gigabytes of storage. Now, all that stuff doesn't sound great, I'll give you that, but here are the Geekbench scores, and if you compare these numbers to last year, the difference is quite significant. The hardware in this phone isn't new or even all that powerful, but that's how Motorola keeps the costs down. The specs are decent enough now, though, to where this phone doesn't just clunk along, barely loading the simplest of apps. It's a perfectly fine Android experience, at least with all the basic stuff. The bummer here is this phone is still running Android 13, and Motorola isn't one to push software updates all that quickly. So who knows if or when Android 14 will ever hit this phone. But I'll say this, Motorola's Android setup is so bare bones and basic that it may not even matter what version of Android this is. You get just the essentials as far as the apps and the Motorola Android experience. It's so simple and familiar, and I think it's something that longtime Motorola users have thoroughly enjoyed. I'm of course going to push this phone a bit harder for my full review, but to me, this really does feel like a semi-decent, usable budget smartphone now, and I'm really relieved to say that. The big 5,000 milliamp battery crammed inside this phone is also something Motorola did right. All their phones have big batteries, and aside from giving you an old, sort of useless USB USB-A charging cable still. The charging speeds supported by this phone, with the proper accessories that you will need to provide yourself, have been bumped up a smidge too. You get 15-watt wired speeds now, so it'll juice up a tad quicker when it finally does die, though that is the only charging option this phone has. Finally, when it comes to the camera setup, or lack thereof, this is one area where you get both a noticeable improvement in some capacity, along with obvious omissions. This phone has one single camera lens around back. It's a vastly improved 50 megapixel f1.8 aperture lens. There's an equally large LED flash that pretends to be its second lens underneath. The selfie camera looks to get a bump in spec as well to a whole 8 megapixels, but Motorola dropped the macro lens and the depth sensor from last year. I don't necessarily hate that, but I can't imagine even the cheapest ultra-wide lens couldn't have been added in here. Inside the camera app, you get the same set of Moto shooting modes and features we've seen for a number of years, albeit limited by the single lens just a bit. There's only like 8x digital zoom, there's no 4K video recording capabilities, there's a high-resolution picture mode which presumably uses more of the quad-pixel lens technology for a sharper shot, and there's other essentials like night mode. But most of the stuff here is like some combination of filters and the illusion of features. This is just a super basic camera setup, and the images you do capture with this phone match that for sure. The pictures are far from the worst I've ever seen on a budget phone, and actually they kind of mirror what we see on other Moto devices. A super soft image with not a lot of detail, a bit wonky with the color balance, leaning more towards a duller true-to-life sort of style, and everything seems a bit overexposed most of the time. You certainly wouldn't buy this phone because of the camera, maybe you even buy it in spite of its camera, but if all you need to do is snap some casual pictures and videos from time to time, this phone will probably be just fine. So in summary, the new 2024 Moto G Play is a completely new and totally improved device that I think warrants a reconsideration if you avoided last year's abysmal offering, maybe due in part to my harsh video. This phone has got a fresh new design that's modern and matches the other Moto phones now. It has twice the storage, more RAM, and a more powerful processor for better performance. It charges faster, the screen is maybe a little brighter, it has dual speakers, which is a nice little cherry on top, and it's cheaper too. For $150, it just might be a decent deal, all things considered. But what do you guys think? Did Motorola do enough here to this phone to make it enticing this year? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video though. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.